Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this guest lecture that is organized in the framework of the EU Qualis Jean Monnet Center of Excellence that I have the pleasure to coordinate with Amandine Crespi. I won't take the floor for too long. I'm just here to kind of set the scene of today's lecture, and my colleague Chiara Armeni, Professor of Environmental Law and Director of the Center for European Law, will then take the floor to introduce in more details today's speaker. But I just wanted to take a few minutes just to present a bit the Center of Excellence that we have been running since April 2022. It's a Center of Excellence that has been launched by the Institute of European Studies, and it aims to tackle the question of inequalities within the EU, and was prompted by the inequalities that we all witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemics, and the way it affected differently different EU member states, different social groups within each member state, but also how it highlighted inequalities among regions and so of the world. And so we decided to have a series of activities, research, but also teaching, and some also involving students, to explore a bit how the EU may help to prevent inequalities, how the EU may help indirectly to foster inequalities between groups and persons. And as part of this Center of Excellence, we have a variety of activities. I'm obliged to use your presence here to advertise a conference we are organizing in May on the topic of European Union and inequalities, during which, for 2.5 days, various researchers from Brussels, but also other universities, are going to tackle different aspects of inequalities. The seats are taken here. Sorry? C'est pris les sièges, pardon. And last but not least, within these activities, we also have a series of guest lectures with external experts, such as Professor Bogojević. I won't pronounce it. I'm sorry. I will pronounce it badly, so I'd rather Bogojević. Yeah, that's it. Sorry. We have a series of guest lectures coordinated by Chiara on environmental issues. And we have also another series of guest lectures on health and inequalities. The students who participated in the guest lecture with Eleanor Brooks last semester might remember it. And so it's with great pleasure that we organize the second edition of this guest lecture on environmental protection and inequalities. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Chiara.
Thank you very much, Chloe. So I'll introduce our fantastic speaker for today. I'm very privileged to be able to invite an old friend. Professor Sanja Bogojević is a professor of law and fellow at Lady Margaret Hall and University of Oxford. She is professor of environmental law. She's also done a lot of research on the interplay between environmental law and EU law. She's published extensively. She's been working in different areas of the role of the market, the role of climate change adjudication, and you will see her CV and her publications quite widely in the space of environmental scholarship. I will not take a long time. We really want to hear from you, Sanja. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very kind introduction and for the very kind invite. It's really great to be here today. I see some old faces. I see some students, old students of mine, and some old colleagues and new faces. And I'm really excited to talk about critical raw materials. So this is a topic that I'm currently pretty much obsessed by and with, and I hope that I will, those of you who are new to the topic, that I will tease you into this field, that it's really taking center stage when we talk about climate neutrality. So what I'll talk today, I'll talk about kind of four main issues. So first we will situate critical raw materials, and we will situate it in the context of the green transition, so towards climate neutrality, very much within the European Green Deal context. So it will be from an EU context. And then we're going to move to looking at the conflicts, or I'll give you an example of two conflicts from two very different jurisdictions. So one from Sweden, an EU member state, and one from Serbia, a non-EU member state. And I'll explain the polycentricity of these conflicts and what I mean by that. And you may perhaps already now wonder why these two conflicts, and I'll explain that in due time. But to me, this is the first time in my research that my also background is kind of taking center stage here. So I'm Swedish-Serbian, but that is not the only reason why I chose these two conflicts, but we'll get to that. And then we're going to get to the Critical Minerals Act. So it's a regulation that has really swooshed by the legislative process at the EU level. And I'll talk about the linearity. So I'll talk about the inability of the act of dealing with the polycentric conflicts that I'll talk about. And then finally, I should also say, I understand that this is an interdisciplinary group. I should kind of as a caveat say that I am a lawyer, so I'm a legal scholar. So some of the wishful thinking, I will situate that from an EU legal scholarship perspective, but part of that, I think, are moving to more kind of critical thinking does involve discussing more deeply with other disciplines, and I'll explain that. So those are the four steps that I'll take in this talk. And if there are any questions or unclarities throughout, just raise your hand, but I'll also leave enough questions towards the end so we can have a discussion. I'll leave time towards the end to have questions, yeah. Okay, so if we start just thinking about critical raw materials, so how many here are already in this field, kind of thinking about critical raw materials or working on critical raw materials? Okay, so a couple of hands. Great. So just to position critical raw materials for those who are new to the subject. So I'll have to I'll do this just so that I can also see. So if we think about the European Green Deal from 2019, there isn't a lot about critical raw materials discourse in the European Green Deal as such, but there is this understanding which prevails, EU's thinking about critical raw materials, that access to resources is a strategic security question for Europe's ambition to deliver the European Green Deal, or the Green Deal. Ensuring the supply of sustainable raw materials, in particular critical raw materials, is a prerequisite to make this transition happen. So what the European Green Deal is saying is that in order to have this path towards climate neutrality, we need to have a secure and sustainable access to critical raw materials. And then some of you may be wondering, well, what are these critical raw materials? And the Commission has very kindly provided a list for us so we don't have to wonder. Since 2017, the Commission publishes this list of critical raw materials. And what it considers, and I'll come to that, it's very much the need for these materials for the functioning of the internal market, and these being scarce and difficult to access. So we have here a list of I think it's 17, or is it 21 now? I can't, yeah, but you'll see the list there. And the four last were added in the final round. So we have lithium, which I'll come back to in a while. So then the question is, how does the Commission identify this? And this is from the draft Critical Minerals Act. It says that in Article 13, so the raw materials are those that score among the highest in terms of strategic importance, forecast demand growth, and difficulty of increasing production. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but to distill that, what the Commission tends to talk about is very much the need for these materials for the functioning of the internal market. This is also why the Critical Minerals Act is based on Article 114. So EU lawyers amongst you, that is the functioning of the internal market provision. The slight issue from EU's perspective with regard to critical minerals is the following. So this is a list of where EU supply of critical minerals comes from. This is again from the Commission's communication on critical minerals. So what do you think the issue is here, if we just look at the map? Yeah?
Europe doesn't have enough, especially when it comes to different countries. When you look to east, you see China, which is holding the type of raw materials which are extremely critical for Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the issues is that the most of EU's supply comes outside of Europe, or outside of the EU, I should specify. So this doesn't mean that within the EU there are no critical minerals, but they're not in production. So we're not mining critical minerals to the same extent as other countries. And looking at this map from a geopolitical kind of perspective, we also see some slight worries. You know, you mentioned China, we also have Russia here and other countries. So this is why kind of the recent rhetoric, again, kind of coming very much from Commission, it talks about kind of like-minded partnerships with regards to kind of critical minerals. So i.e. moving away from these geopolitical risks. So if we kind of go back to thinking about the European Green Deal, what the position of the EU is that we need to access critical minerals in order to secure the European deal, but we need to make sure that the supply is secured, which currently, looking at this map, it isn't. The slide, well, I don't know if it's an issue, but the slide kind of added contextual kind of fact is that the EU is not the only jurisdiction that's thinking about critical raw materials. So we know that climate neutrality is in legislations, or in many legislations across the world. So this is just a very, very kind of a short summary of some of the other jurisdictions around the world who are talking about the need to access critical minerals. So here we have the Australian government, we have India, we have Japan, we have the UK, and these policy documents are all very similarly worded. The need for critical minerals in order to have the just transition or climate neutral transition, and the need to have a secure supply chain of these. So what this has created is something called a little bit of a gold rush for critical raw materials. So it's not just the need that the EU has, but it's also that other jurisdictions around the world are increasingly pushing for an access to critical raw materials. So this is the context in which the critical raw materials debate exists. And then I'll just kind of now very briefly give you two examples of the conflicts that this kind of gold rush has created for critical raw materials. So I call these polycentric conflicts. And there is a lot of discussion, particularly in the EU context, about polycentricity. The EU is a polycentric governance structure, or we have Ostrom, which we also talk about climate change being a polycentric issue or a problem. But here I take the definition by Fuller, who's a legal scholar. So he talked about polycentricity being, he said, we should think about these relationships very much as a spider web. So he said a polycentric relationship is that if you pull in one direction, they may be unrelated, but if you pull in one direction, the pattern will change throughout the net. So that is polycentricity. So he talks about, we may visualize this kind of situation by thinking of a spider web. A pull on one strand will distribute tensions after a complicated pattern throughout the web as a whole. So he talks about kind of the many-centered kind of crossings. So the reason why I think polycentricity is a good frame for the kind of conflicts that we'll discuss is that the conflicts do not arise as a direct cause. So it's not that the EU is the core reason for these conflicts, but the push for critical raw materials that the EU and other jurisdictions are pushing for is perpetuating these conflicts. So it's a pull in that spider web. And I'll come back to discussing that. But this is the kind of polycentricity that I'm thinking about here. So if I talk about the first case study, so this is a case study of Serbia, and this is the case study that how kind of my fascination for this subject, in fact, started. So this is probably 3 years back, so before the Critical Minerals Act. And as I said, I'm Swedish Serbian, and so I read both kind of Serbian newspapers and Swedish newspapers. And reading Swedish newspapers, it was all very much about electrical cars. We need electrical cars. If you have an electric car, you're a bit of a kind of green hero. And then I was reading kind of the Serbian newspapers, and it was all about lithium mining and the conflicts the lithium mining was causing. And I thought that was really interesting, geographically not being that far apart from each other, but then we have these kind of ideals for the green transition that are completely ignoring the conflicts that they're causing, kind of in very close proximity to that action. So if we look at Serbia in the case of lithium, let me just give you a little bit of background to what I've just said. If we think about road transport, we see here that this is from the European Environment Agency. So it says here that road transport constitutes the highest proportion of overall transport emissions. So if we're thinking about climate action, this becomes an obvious point, or kind of the need for taking action. So we have to rethink road transportation. So then the answer is, well, how do we then rethink and reduce these emissions? And then we get here. I've kind of already given you, it's not a cliffhanger anymore, but this is a picture of lithium. And lithium what do you need lithium for in this context? Batteries, exactly. So you will need lithium for electrical cars, for example, in those batteries. And this is, again, coming back to the communication from the Commission. Here it says that electrical vehicles, I'm reading just the highlighted one, and energy storage, the EU would need up to 18 times more lithium and almost 60 times more lithium compared to the current supply to the whole EU economy. Electrical vehicles could increase tenfold by 2050. So we see here there is a huge demand for lithium in order to deal with emissions from transportation. So there is a huge market for lithium. So how does Serbia then come into play? So Serbia, you'll have kind of a little map there. And I don't know if Rio Tinto is kind of a big mining conglomerate. It has a really fascinating history, if you're ever interested in kind of the history of mining companies. But it dates to the early 1900s. It was present in Europe for actually kind of a couple of 100 years now in different mining projects. So Rio Tinto, as a mining company, was present in Serbia way before kind of the European Green Deal. So it identified Serbia already in 2004, and it identified the jadarite. So it's a form of lithium in the Jadar region. So here it says, and this is from Rio Tinto's website, it says that the Jadar project in Serbia is one of the largest greenfield lithium projects in the world. And it basically said that the level or the amount of lithium in Serbia, it had estimated that it could feed 90% of Europe's demand for lithium. So a huge, huge market potential. So if we go here, the Serbian government at the time was still very much kind of the same political leaders in place. They defined the Jadar project of an exceptional importance for Serbia already kind of in 2018, and that has very much still been the rhetoric, that this is of an exceptional importance for Serbia's economic development. And what happened in this couple of years after 2018 was that the government then proposed And I should perhaps give a little bit of context before I get to the constitutional propositions. What happened was that in the Jadar region, it's an agricultural region. So it's also called the breadbasket of Serbia. So that's where most of the agricultural activity is happening. So some landowners sold off their land to Rio Tinto because they needed access to land, and others didn't want to do that. So it was already creating a conflict in the community. And those farmers or property holders who were not so keen to sell off their property became an issue for the mining company. So what the government then suggested was to rewrite or reconfigure the right to property provision, Article 58 of the Constitution. So most constitutions in kind of modern democracies would have something very similar to Serbia's Article 58. So it says here that right of property may be revoked or restricted only in public interest, and then you will have to be compensated. So what the proposal was from the government, that this would be changed, so not in the public interest, but in the interest as defined by the executive. So I should mention that in addition to the lithium potentials, Serbia also has a lot of activity from, in particular, Chinese mining companies. So there is a long tradition of mining companies kind of abusing existing kind of environmental and other rights. So there was a huge then uprising in Serbia in light of these constitutional propositions. So you can see here, this is from The Guardian, there were kind of repeated demonstrations in Belgrade, but really across Serbia, in light of these constitutional proposals. And this is a wonderful MPhil dissertation by Nina Đukanović, who was actually on the fields and doing kind of anthropological work. So she was interviewing the farmers who didn't want to sell in the Jadar region. And what she found, so this is the highlighted, she found that the local stress that farming, the key economic activity in the region, provides livelihood to a much larger group of people than what the mining company would employ, as well as better jobs in terms of quality of life. So local resistance to the mining project thus presented a fundamental challenge to the hegemonic view on sustainability that is based on mining and extractivism. So her point is that there is actually here a conflict of what we understand as a sustainable transformation. So the local farmers were arguing that our way of life is actually the one that's sustainable and not that what the mining company proposes. And what is also interesting here, if we think about the relationships that the EU has with countries outside of the EU, the lithium here is not for the local demand. So lithium here is very much for exportation. So it's for sustainable life for someone else and not in Serbia. So this is the first kind of conflict, don't worry. And then we'll get to Sweden, a very different case study, but there are some parallels with regards to polycentricity. Yeah. So Sweden, I'll give you this little slide. I don't appreciate that you will kind of understand Swedish here. But this is the LKAB, the biggest mining company in Sweden, their CEO. And this is the Energy and Innovation Minister, Ebba Busch, at the 1st of January, or I think it might have been the 4th of January last year. So they are in Kiruna, which is a city in the north of Sweden. And this is when Sweden had just taken over the presidency of Europe. So this was their launch of Sweden's presidency. And at this day, they announced the biggest find in Europe of rare earth deposits. And then we wonder, well, what are rare earth deposits? But it's the smallest, kind of most precious group of critical raw materials. So they found this in Sweden, and this was huge news in Sweden, but also in Europe. Now, the slight issue with this find is kind of illustrated in this kind of slide. But before I get to that, I just want to say that Sweden has a very long mining history. So, I mean, again, this is all in Swedish, so I appreciate that it's a bit difficult to decipher. But you will see here that it goes, this one. It's already from, the 13th century of mining in the country. So a very long mining history. And here you will see the dots of all the situation of the mining activity. And the slight issue is that most mines are in the north, which is also on Sami land, so indigenous people. And this is then slightly problematic for a number of reasons. So the Sami community, they have claimed throughout kind of the recent history that any kind of green projects for energy sources have inflicted with their way of life. So it's not just mining, but it's also windmills and hydropower plants. And this is the cumulative pressure piece. So they inflict on the grazing activities of reindeer herding, which is part of the Sami community. So one of the kind of added issue here is that Sweden then has a very long history of inflicting or causing or discriminating on the Sami community. So there is something called the Truth Commission in the Scandinavian countries, and Norway. So the Truth Commission was set up by the Swedish Parliament to report and investigate the history of the treatment of Samis in Sweden. So this Truth Commission also exists or has been set up in Norway and in Finland. And the one in Norway has already delivered their findings, and they found that the Norwegian state has repeatedly discriminated the Sami population. So you will see here at the top kind of little box, it says here, the time has come to bring to light the history of and reality for Sami people. The Truth Commission has a considerable and vital work ahead of them in the investigation of state abuses to the Sami people and individual Samis as well as historical discrimination that continue till today. So the point here is that the finding of the mine on Sami land exists in a very delicate and particular historical context. And what this has created is actually, it has inflicted some of these discourses about climate neutrality pathways. So this is from DN, which is the biggest newspaper in Sweden. And this is a leading editorial comment. And the heading is that there are two professions that you have to be born to, the monarch and kind of the Sami. So the argument here is that, that the Samis are abusing their privileges as a minority and that they stand in way for climate neutrality. And obviously, this editorial caused a huge outrage in Sweden. And then there was a lot of kind of backwards and forwards in the newspaper about, well, to what extent should Sami's rights be protected, or should we jeopardize Sami as a people in order to secure a climate neutral pathway by having access to these materials? So I'm just a little bit wary of the time. I should mention, I'll just give you a very brief example, that critical raw materials are not currently mined in Sweden, so there are no current conflicts as such to talk about, but there are lots of examples of mining activity on Sami land that has caused conflicts. And these conflicts are interesting to look at as a bit of a kind of a warning sign to pushing ahead with critical raw mining in the same region. So the biggest, or probably in the Swedish context, the most kind of medialized example is of Beowulf mining on Sami land. So this is the north, And you'll see the green area, this is where the Sami land for herding, and then the mine is kind of smack in the middle of it. And this conflict, so the push is that the Beowulf Mining, which is again kind of an international mining conglomerate with London as its headquarter, they want, or they have applied for permits for mining, and then you have the Samis and the local communities kind of challenging those permits. And this has been, I mean, for a legal scholar, this is absolutely fascinating because that conflict has developed over 10 years. And it's currently with the highest environmental court in Sweden. So it's still unresolved. And I think this is a really interesting kind of example of thinking about, well, these conflicts that potentially critical raw materials can give rise to, are they intractable? And what intractable basically means that there's no no consensual kind of outcome. So if we think about, and what I found really interesting looking at Sweden and thinking about kind of my previous Serbian case study, is that the mining company uses very similar argumentation. So their argument is that, look, not only are we enabling the green transition by accessing these vital minerals for the net zero kind of transformation, but we are also a net zero operation. So they're talking about offsetting, they're also talking about being kind of a climate neutral operation. And then this is kind of another kind of key argument. They say, look, there will be tons of resources we're giving back to communities that are kind of slowly dying, we're creating jobs. I mean, it's almost kind of copy and paste what Rio Tinto said in the Serbian kind of context. In Sweden, we have something called the Sami Parliament. It doesn't have much substantive power beyond that they need to be consulted or they have consultation kind of powers. And in this context, in this specific kind of Kalak case, they said very similarly to what Nina Djukanovic found in the Serbian context. They said, in weighting in different national interests, reindeer husbandry should be given priority ahead of mining. That's a typo there, since it promotes in the most appropriate way long-term stewardship of land, water, and the rest of the physical environment. So their argument is very much similar to what the local communities in Serbia were arguing. They said, well, look, we're the ones who are actually conducting a sustainable way of life, not the mining company. So we have here kind of a conflict in what actually sustainability means. And then this is all unfolding in these colonial legacies. Okay, so what I've kind of talked so far is that critical minerals, from the EU perspective, we need it for the climate neutral transition. However, we don't often talk about these conflicts. And these are the two examples that I've given, conflicts that I think exist both within the EU and outside of the EU. So let's think about then the kind of Critical Raw Materials Act. And I say here that it's kind of the linearity. And this is a word or description that I've borrowed from Liz Fisher, my colleague. So she talks about how climate action is often linear, and what she means by that, she says that that we see climate action as kind of going from A to B, and it's a straight kind of line between the two. We don't appreciate exactly kind of these polycentric conflicts that come along the way, and I think this is a good description of the Critical Minerals Act. So if we look at the Critical Minerals Act, I will just kind of very quickly highlight just some points from it. It's an utterly fascinating legal proposal. So even those of you who are not lawyers, I would strongly encourage you to read it because it is, to me, it's pretty kind of mind-blowing. So one of the kind of main first things that this proposal does is that the regulation aims to improve the functioning of the internal market. So this is an internal market instrument, which we can discuss kind of the meaning of. So it's creating and ensuring access to a secure and sustainable supply of critical raw materials. And then the way it suggests to do this, it creates these targets. And this is, again, kind of very classical for climate legislation these days, that you have targets. And it's really urgent. I mean, if we think here, it's by 2030. I mean, that is pretty soon. So by 2030, a lot of things need to happen. So the production needs to be at least 10% in the EU, the processing 40% in the EU, and then 15 of the union's annual consumption needs to also happen, kind of the recycling needs to happen also in the EU. So they're really ambitious targets. And there is a fourth target, which I didn't list here, is that an external or a non-EU country can only supply a maximum of 65% of a critical raw material. So it's looking to diversify supply chains, but it's also looking to increase production of critical raw materials within the EU. And then it does kind of, we can wonder, well, how will it do that? And it kind of proposes really a new governance structure. So it proposes a new governance structure at the national, but also at the EU level. So at the national level, it says that member states need to set up a so-called one-stop shop. And what that means is that there needs to be one national competent authority. And what that authority needs to do is to investigate, draw up these national programs to see, well, what kind of minerals do we have? Could they be exploited and to what extent? So that's Article 8. It also needs to give an opinion on these. And this is really interesting, the final point. All authorities concerned shall ensure that those processes are treated in the most rapid way possible in accordance with Union and national law, Article 9. So there is also a sense of urgency. And although the kind of the act is, or the regulation is kind of quite careful to say not to undermine environmental impact assessments, there is kind of a question to what extent that urgency may still kind of create that kind of pressurized approach. Then at the EU level, there will be a so-called European Critical Raw Materials Board, which I think it's interesting that the Commission will chair. The Commission kind of is finding itself. So it will be composed by member states and the Commission. And they will discuss and give an opinion on strategic projects, and I'll get to what that is. And I love Article 36. It says that it has the best endeavors to reach consensus. So it's not really clear how it's going to decide. It just says that the intention is for consensus, but clearly there is some room for deviation. Okay, so there is a governance structure at the national and at the EU, and the point that at the national level, they need to check what's kind of happening in our backyard. Are the critical minerals? Can we produce them? Can we process them? And at the EU level, they are processing then these different projects. And there are two different projects. So there is something called strategic projects, and there is something called strategic partnerships in order to secure these supply chains. So a strategic project is then the Commission recognizes a project as a strategic project, and then it has kind of a line of criteria. And the first criteria is that it needs to have a meaningful contribution to the security of the Union's supply of strategic raw materials. So basically, can it help the functioning of the internal market? It needs to be technically feasible. And then C is where it gets interesting. It talks about that the project must, or that it would be implemented sustainably. And then it has these almost copy-pasted kind of list of what that means. So it says here that, in particular, environmental impacts, human and labor rights, quality jobs potential, meaningful engagement with local communities, transparent business practices, that they will have to consider when they decide whether something is a strategic project. But if you look at kind of the wording here, and again, if we think about the polycentric conflicts examples, they have very different understandings of what, a quality of a job is, or what a sustainable practice is, or what a, So when there is a conflict of that kind, the directive doesn't actually say how those different protections, or which specific community, should the Sami communities be kind of, or enjoy specific protection. So it's a very kind of vaguely defined set of legal safeguards. And then we have strategic partnerships. So these are then when the EU closes a partnership with countries outside of the EU. And again, this is the board kind of thinking about these strategic partnerships. And again, it will look at number one, it's security of supply, improving cooperations, and reaching these targets. So this is very much the focus, to give the EU access to these materials. And then thinking about which third countries should be prioritized. So it talks about priority. It doesn't talk about, banning or excluding. It just talks about, well, who's going to be our number one partner? But it doesn't mean that any other will be excluded. Then you will have to look at, the third country's regulatory framework, and it's copy-pasted from kind of the previous C, local communities, respect of human and labor rights. But again, there are very few kind of benchmarks here. So I should say that, some of the conflicts that I discussed, they're not, the discussion around this act, the discussions have not been oblivious to those kind of, the need to kind of safeguard a sustainable kind of access. And the act has two ways through which to safeguard sustainability. So one is the so-called environmental footprint declarations. So the Commission here is empowered, so it doesn't have to, it can just choose to establish or create so-called declarations. And basically in this declaration, it would consider the environmental footprint of a particular material and declare that. And again, it's not a legal safeguard as such. It's more of a kind of a declaratory form that is very much to the Commission's discretion whether it would pursue it. And then it has also a power to create so-called recognized schemes. So if governments or organizations have created so-called certification schemes, then the Commission can adopt these. So basically, if you then have a critical mineral, you could be part of this scheme if you have, for example, a transparent and fair and non-discriminatory kind of engagement, environmentally sustainable practices, socially responsible practices, and so on and so forth. But again, what the case studies show is that what sustainable actually means is not kind of clear. We can discuss the act in more detail, but I will kind of get to my final point, and then we could kind of discuss all of this. So the final point is really kind of how we, and as I said, I think about this subject as a legal scholar. So thinking about how do we move from this wishful kind of to more kind of critical thinking. And I think there are kind of three things in particular that within EU law or within the EU sphere that we need to be kind of more attuned to. So there is a lot of information and there is a lot of literature and there are many studies on the negative effects on mining. So this is in a sense not a novel or new finding. So the negative effects of mining on the local communities or indigenous communities, we have this in particular from Australia and the North American context. But we don't kind of tie that literature to critical raw materials mining. So we have lots of information about coal mining and the negative effects of coal mining, and the EU is moving away from coal mining. but we don't necessarily make the connection between those practices and critical raw material practices. And the question is, are those practices only different as to the product, i.e. the critical raw materials you need for climate neutrality and coal we need to move away from for climate neutrality, or are they actually different also in form? So that is kind of the first link that I think needs to be kind of made more clearly or thought about more clearly in EU law. But also that if we think about the Swedish study, there is very little on the role of indigenous communities in EU law. I mean, just researching the Swedish case study, I found a master's thesis from Uppsala University about the role of indigenous in EU law. But generally, we don't really discuss what is the role of indigenous communities. And one answer could be, well, their protection comes from international law. So EU law does not have to provide that. It is the relationship between national and international law. But it does require a little bit of thinking about the protection that EU law does give to local communities, and in particular, kind of indigenous communities. And then we have the second point, which is the legacy of colonialism. And what was interesting, kind of again, researching the Swedish case study, was that, I mean, really fascinating kind of scholarship, where they said, fine, Sweden does have also colonial past, but it's not as bad as English colonial past. So we see this kind of relativism of colonialism in some of the literature, which we also have to consider whether that is an appropriate way to talk about some of the colonial legacies that still have not been confronted with, particularly in the Swedish context. So when we talk about the relationship with third countries, this is also a topic, but I think in the Serbian context, colonialism is obviously not an appropriate lens, but we also have to think about the relationship that the EU kind of has with countries outside of its own borders. And this is kind of then really taking me to my final point, is thinking about the European Green Deal. It is to create a new growth strategy for Europe, to create a climate neutral pathway, a sustainable pathway, but it's really kind of sustainable for whom? And I'll end on that note. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sanja. It was so rich and thought-provoking. I think I'll just dive straight into questions. If anyone has any questions for clarification, for
I didn't pick up the link with colonial legacy. Actually, can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so that is very much with regard to the Swedish case study. So Sweden, as I said, it has a very long mining history, and so it's very much so there are two ways of that, or two fronts of the legacy. So one is the treatment of Samis, which is kind of the indigenous community in Sweden. So which is also interesting to just read on the history of mining activities in Sweden. The first kind of records of abuses and discrimination and kind of control of Sami population really comes parallel with the finding of silver in the north. So you see kind of the presence of the Swedish church and the presence of the Swedish state kind of emerging alongside the finding of kind of precious minerals. So it's kind of dealing with that legacy. So there's that Truth Commission report that's coming out. But in Sweden, I grew up in the south. I'm from Malmö. And so Samis is something that we would never, it was never, in our history class, we never talked about the Samis. So I think that is changing in Sweden, but there is kind of a need to recognize those kind of colonial legacies. So that is kind of with regards to the Samis in Sweden, but it's also those, I'll stop. Yeah,
Okay,
does that help?
Yeah, that's how definitely. I'm more. I can attune with the French case, is the Kanak case.
Yeah.
In New Caledonia.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
didn't even know about Swedish. Yeah, very interesting.
Any?
I mean, what was interesting, as I said, I'm kind of currently obsessed with critical raw materials, but I presented on the Swedish case study recently, and then someone said, oh, because I had colonialism in my title, and they said, oh, you have colonialism in your title, and I thought you would talk about Congo. So it's also, and I think that is interesting, that in a sense, that we are, and I'm not arguing that lens is not necessary, but it's interesting that there is also within Europe kind of practices
Yeah,
that are kind of
definitely,
problematic.
definitely.
And we'll take another question, two other question, and three. Let's say 3 in a row, so we can just take the conversation up and run.
I was wondering who is part of the Truth Commission.
Sorry?
Who's part of the Truth Commission?
So who conducts it?
Yeah, who are the people who are actually conducting
Yeah. So they're appointed by, so they're supposed to be kind of independent from the state.
Yeah.
So it's different kind of researchers. I can't actually remember how many they are, but it's kind of historians, and then the purpose of the report is to report to the parliament. And then, and that report has been delayed in the Swedish context. So, for example, in the Norwegian context, what came out was exactly that they recognized that the Norwegian Samis had been abused and discriminated. But what was interesting from that report is that they also said, the Samis need their rights to land and the rights to water and the rights to, need to be more clearly clarified. So they also come with recommendations that could be useful for legislators to think about.
I take this. There's 2 questions, and I'll let you.
Yeah,
Please.
I have a question related to public participation, because you mentioned a strategic project to be defined by the Commission, and strategic partnership by the board, so the member states and the Commission. So where would the Sami community voices, citizens' voices, come up in the process?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great kind of question to investigate. I mean, my understanding is that that would happen at the national level, but in the Swedish context, one of my kind of, I thought, a really good kind of illustrative example or description of kind of Sami rights in Sweden. So there are some instances where they need to be consulted, and that consultation right has been described as a punch in thin air. In a sense, you have a right, but it doesn't actually. And this is kind of the question of intractable conflicts. This is actually, in the Swedish context, how these conflicts have been described. In the Kallak case, as I said, the mining company have also kind of made an effort to have consultation sessions, and then the Samis kind of along the 9-year period are refusing to engage because their argument is that, but there is no, we just see things very differently. There is no way of compromise. I mean, that is, a compromise. The argument is that compromise from us is basically the end of our kind of us as peoples, and then kind of how do you deal with that?
I've been very unsuccessful in taking 3 questions in a row, so apologies for that.
Yeah, I just
Please.
would like to know all the different resources that you use in your work. So, for example, there is the critical raw material working group for the review. So I think they send a report each year, so you use it, okay? And so there is also like the electronic daily documents.
Sorry, which one?
The open granting.
Yeah.
Okay, and there is like also the end. So Generality of Proposal Critical Raw Material Act 1923.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is also maybe another document or resource that they can use to work on this subject.
Yeah, I mean, there is lots of information. I mean, something that has been really interesting to follow is the reports in the so reports in the council. So when the council is deliberating the act. So I mean, this is the beauty of EU law legislation, or proposals, that you can follow the discussions. So if you just the published discussions. So on that, so if you go to Critical Minerals Act or regulations, and then they're called impact assessments, the regulatory impact assessments, and then you can actually follow what different member states are arguing. So for example, one of the early one was by the Romanian government, and they were arguing that 2030 is a completely unrealistic target, because in a sense it takes time not only to investigate and see what minerals, but kind of which are technically feasible, and you need consultation. So it's interesting to kind of, does that answer your question? But there's lots of information of that kind.
I have one question here, one question there, and I will stick to take 2 questions in a row.
Oh, okay. Perhaps I'm
I'm also like too enthusiastic.
So my question is, how much different is the case of indigenous population opposing these public projects, in this case of mining reasons, from those of public local communities opposing strategic energy projects by means of permitting processes and social acceptance basis?
Question? Good question.
Sorry.
That's you then.
I will keep it short. You mentioned that the adoption of the Raw Material Act was quite quick and speedy, and I was wondering what was the position of the European Parliament on that instrument?
Yeah.
Because it's notably sometimes voices the views of like minorities or local communities, and I was wondering whether they just signed off the text or whether there were debates in the Parliament about the consequences that you pointed out.
Yeah, 2 great questions. Yeah, I mean, so I should say that, this is very much, as I said, Serbia as the case study was my first kind of dip into this subject, and this was kind of before the hype even around critical raw materials. I mean,
You were talking about Jogovic. That's another presentation.
That's another presentation, exactly. Actually, there is Novak Djokovic element to that case study, which I won't kind of mention now. And I mean, just coming back to your question, and then kind of the Swedish kind of case study was second. And what I thought was interesting, and this is kind of what I already said, is that, the mining companies are saying the same thing, but the local communities are saying the same thing, although the local communities in the Serbian context are not indigenous. So I do think there is a pattern of discontent with these kind of mining proposals, in the sense that, I mean, sustainability, I think, is very much, and the fact that they say, look, but the jobs that our current industry gives us is much better, and what is a green job? What is a good job? So I think, as I said, this is very much the start of my critical minds story. So what I would like to do is actually to look at more kind of case studies, national case studies, and see kind of what is the level of discontent and how our voices, which mechanisms provide voices for the local communities. And so this is kind of the start of a much bigger kind of mapping exercise. I mean, the next case study that we'd like to look at, because Denmark, I mean, this is, again, utterly fascinating, but Greenland is an autonomous, kind of self-governed, but when it comes to mining minerals belong to the crown, which is, again, kind of really interesting. And Denmark has now recently, because they have critical raw material on Greenland, and they have signed a partnership with Europe. So that would be, I would love to kind of look at that case study. So very much in line with your comment, thinking about what is it that the local communities kind of are arguing, and are those voices being heard? And I mean, just to clarify, I'm not against critical raw materials. I'm mining. I think it's this urgency and the push, and the fact that it's seen in a very kind of linear way. I mean, if you just look at, as Clara said, I'm based in the UK, and if you look at the net zero strategy, I mean, Boris Johnson always kind of gave very, very quotable statements. But anyway, the one statement from the net zero strategy when he was in power is very much kind of, we're going to meet climate neutrality without jeopardizing the things that we love. And how do we do that? We do that through, so it's these kind of idealized pictures of, we're going to reach climate neutrality by keeping the exact same lifestyle that we have. Well, the price has to be paid somewhere, and it's paid not necessarily in your community, but in someone else's community. And do we need to consider that, perhaps? And my argument would be yes, probably. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Well, thank you very much.
You have a question on the...
Yeah, on the commission. Yeah, so the act was proposed in March of last year, and there was already a preliminary agreement in December. I mean, it is as speedy as it gets. And I think it shows kind of the appetite. I mean, someone mentioned France, but France is, again, kind of a huge advocate. I mean, in Sweden, a huge advocate for critical raw material mining. They're saying, this is, the opportunity for Sweden to become a green superpower. It's very much seen as this is the time for us. So I think within the council, there is definitely a lot of appetite. From the parliament, I followed a little bit, and again, in the context of the Swedish case study, I followed a little bit to what extent the indigenous community kind of had any kind of power. And I know that there was some kind of pushback. There are some kind of minor safeguards that the parliament kind of put in place that I have written about, but I didn't discuss it here in much detail.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I'm
you.
aware of us running a little bit against time. I think the question of distributed conflicts, they're all over, and they always relate to who's going to pay the cost. I mean, the Commission is looking at the just transition pathway, and they seem to select what conflicts are important. So coal mining sector is going to pay, so let's support, but the other sectors or the community. So I think this is really pertinent to all sorts of other issues. So thank you very much for coming to us.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you
the
very much
questions.
for coming to the lecture. This will be put on the website at some point, and to be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, I know it.
I know. You was the one that, like the start. It was like a short, I didn't.
I'll let you.
Yeah, I know So is it a global? So have you seen?
Yeah, I saw the map that you.
Yeah, so I would go.
I was wondering where you.
Yeah, I'll give you the.